All right, guys, this is number 3 in my lecture series. This one is on the end of the Cold War. As you know, the Cold War is a dominant cultural, political, and economic phenomenon from 1945 until the early 1990s. It affects almost the entire planet as the United States and the Soviet Union slug it out for supremacy. They don't fight each other. They support through proxy conflicts and funding and weapons and money and soldiers in various conflicts all around the world. But that will come to an end. And it mostly comes to an end because of the weakness of the Soviet system. It crashes down upon itself along with increasing competition from the United States. So let's run through the major causes of the Cold War. The first is the Soviet Union increasingly supports old, decrepit leadership. They literally don't want to change anything. They don't want to do anything unusual or change with the times. And in the early 1980s, we get 2 consecutive Soviet leaders who are diagnosed with terminal illnesses, either, we don't know exactly the details, either before they take power or very soon after they take power. And that was done intentionally. Old men that are sick aren't going to change anything. We want to keep it the way it is. We believe our system is right. We pull out the same quotes from 30 years ago, and we're just going to be fine because we have nuclear weapons. And there's no innovation. There's no change. And so it's increasingly just bad, old, mediocre leadership making bad decisions. We also see the fact that there is the rise of Islamism in the Middle East and how that impacts the Soviet Union. We know that Iran has a revolution in 1979. Iran borders the Soviet Union. Next to Iran is also Afghanistan. Afghanistan is led in the late 1970s by a pro-communist government. However, there is an increasingly conservative Islamic movement to overthrow that government. The Soviet Union decides to invade Afghanistan in 1979. They do so because they want to support their communist brethren on their border, and also they want to make sure that this Islamism movement of conservative, more traditional fundamental Islam does not cross the border into the Soviet Union. Afghanistan and Iran border the southern part of the Soviet Union that today would be the independent nations of Central Asia that end in stan. So places like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Tajikistan. And the Soviet leadership is concerned that this conservative reactionary Islam will influence their citizens, and then we will see Islamic revolutions in the Soviet Union, which of course the Soviet Union as a communist society is atheistic, and they do not want to see any religious involvement or revolution in their society. So it is decided to invade. Now, Afghanistan is a relatively poor country. The Soviets are one of the world's great powers. They have a big, strong military. This will be an easy one. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is often compared to the American invasion of Vietnam. A superior force fighting an ideological war about communism or democracy or whatever is going to be defeated by a small nation of people literally fighting for their homes, for their lives, etc. Now, Afghanistan has long been called the graveyard of empires. The 19th century British, who had the biggest empire in history, are defeated by the Afghanis in the 19th century. So this is a place that's really hard to fight in. There are 15,000-foot tall mountain ranges with lots of caves. There's deserts. It's an incredibly diverse, difficult place to conquer. And so the Soviets are going to end up taking the L. They fight for the next 8.5 years. They end up losing. They will come back home in 1987, losing thousands of men, losing billions of dollars, and losing their reputation as a great power. So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan helps facilitate the downfall of their society because of their loss in that conflict. We also see the comparison with both Western Europe and the Chinese. Western Europe, of course, the Soviets have been telling their people for decades that capitalism is decadent, that it's weak, that it's excessive, that it is vain, and that it is not superior to their lifestyle, that they have it best. And as the 80s roll around, we start to be able to get access to more information. It's harder and harder as more modern technology like satellite television develops to keep people from finding out information. And so we compare ourselves to what's happening in the West. And the West has got a lifestyle we don't have. As we smuggle in Western clothes and Western music, they've got cool stuff we don't have. Now, the other comparison is the Chinese. Now, the Chinese actually copy their communist system after the Soviet Union. But in the late 1970s, as discussed in a previous lecture, we liberalized our economy. And boy, by the middle 1980s, has it started to take off. We've massively reduced our poverty rate. We're starting to increase our manufacturing centers, and we've become the world's greatest producer of goods. the Soviets are weak compared to that. And it's one thing to be weak compared to the decadent West, but when you're weak compared to its fellow communist society that copied off of you, that looks bad. And so people are going to start to be frustrated and angry about the problems of their society, especially compared to their rivals. Also in the 1980s, we have American President Ronald Reagan. You'll hear much more about him next year in APWH, but Reagan is going to be very much an anti-communist. He calls the Soviet Union the evil empire. He gives a speech in Berlin in 1987. He will say, Mr. Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union at that time, tear down this wall, and he is going to be someone who ardently fights the Soviet Union. Now, he does this by spending billions and billions of dollars on new military ideology. My personal favorite is we have something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, nicknamed Star Wars. And we're going to put satellites in space. They're going to shoot lasers that knock down nuclear weapons. Now, if you've ever seen a 1980s computer, they were pretty minimal. This is a ridiculous proposition. It'd be hard to do now. It was almost impossible to do in the 1980s. In fact, it never happened. The United States spends billions and billions of dollars on this project. It's a failure. But because we spend billions of dollars on it, the Soviets will spend billions of dollars on it as well. And this is going to be a problem because they don't have the money to spend. They are going to waste a lot of money that could have been beneficial to shore up some infrastructure in their society, their aging roads or bridges or sewers. It could have been something to help raise the standard of living for the average Soviet citizen. Instead, they wasted on a fictional program that will never go into place. And that's going to be the problem that we see. Now, the last major cause of this end of the Soviet system is that they get a younger leader in 1985. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev is a man who is in his 50s when he takes power, so he's practically a child after his two predecessors had been mid to late 70s. Gorbachev is convinced that the Soviet Union must reform, that we cannot continue to do the same things we've been doing for 30 years. The West has passed us by. We've got to modernize our system. And so he's going to enact a couple of reforms that are very different. These two reforms, one is called glasnost. In English, that means openness. When we say about openness, what he meant was freedom of the press and also some local elections, things for like city councilors and mayors. So nothing on the national level. He's still going to be the dictator of the country, but some local elections. He thought this would energize his society and encourage people that the change is possible, that there is something positive that can happen. What it does is allow the newly given press freedoms are used against him. And this is at the time when we're in Afghanistan and we start to see a lot of investigative reporting. Why are we in Afghanistan? What's the purpose? How much money are we spending? All these questions we could have never asked in previous administrations. Now we're asking. The free press is a tough one if you're not used to it. So when you give the people of the Soviet Union a little bit of freedom, they aren't satisfied. They don't like a little bit of freedom, which is what Gorbachev thought. They want a lot of freedom. They really want a lot of freedom. And so that's not going to work when we try to give them a diet little taste. They want a lot more of it. Now, the other reform is called perestroika. Perestroika translates in English as restructuring. What does that mean? A restructuring of the economy. We're going to allow some capitalism in there. Now, the big things in Soviet society are still owned by the government. The major industries such as railroads or steel production or the airports. But we're going to allow private business. We're going to allow some Western companies to come in. In the late 1980s, we open up a McDonald's in Moscow. And so, again, instead of thinking, oh, we'll give people a little bit of opportunity, they'll be excited and they'll be thankful. No, they want more. They are not satisfied with a little bit of profit, a little bit of motivation. Those things that communism sucks out of people, they get excited about the chances they're given and they want to do something with it. So Gorbachev thought these reforms would help invigorate the country, help it survive, help it progress. In fact, all it did was show many Soviet citizens that their system is terrible and it doesn't work and that these little reforms need to go all the way and not stop halfway through. The other thing that Gorbachev does is in the summer of 1989, he announces that the Soviet Union will no longer interfere in Eastern Europe. Now, as you know from our discussion last week, the Soviet Union has dominated Eastern Europe since 1945. There are numerous occasions in the 1950s and 60s where Eastern European nations tried to remove themselves from Soviet control, offer elections, have a free press, and every time the Soviets come in with the tanks and say no and people are killed, and they flex on them. Gorbachev announces in the summer of 1989 that they will no longer enforce that policy. Now, there's a lot of speculation why he does this. Why would you tell people, I'm not going to enforce your curfew. I'm going to be asleep. So if you come in at 12:30 and you're supposed to be here at 12, I'll never know unless you make a big noise. That seems like inviting people to miss curfew. His thought was that he knew they couldn't afford to do this. They had so many financial problems. And so if I announce it, it doesn't make me look weak. If I don't announce it and somebody does rebel against us and we don't do anything about it, we look weaker. That was at least his logic. What it does is encourage people in Eastern Europe to start to rebel against their communist governments and make them want independence. And we start seeing the movement in the summer of 1989. We see protest. We see hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets, marching for more freedom and autonomy. And in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall in Berlin, Germany, the symbol of the differences between the two sides, will actually be opened by the East German government, and people can cross over to the other side. And within days, we are physically knocking down the wall, and the wall will come down. In 1990, the German state will be reunified after 45 years apart. East and West Germany no more, a unified single Germany, which has been the case for the last 30 years. And then finally, on December 25th, Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev himself resigns in a public statement, which ends the Soviet Union. The next day, Russia secedes from the Soviet Union, and we end up with 15 different countries coming out of what used to be the Soviet Union. The stands of Central Asia, Moldova, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all those countries will become independent in that time period. So we have an independent Russia, which we've had for approximately the last 29 years. So the fall of the Soviet Union is definitely helped along by American pressure and American policy, but at the end, it's the weakness of their own communist system, the lack of opportunity for people, the terrible leaders for decades at a time, the stupid decisions like invading Afghanistan, which is very similar to the American invasion of Vietnam in impact. And so there's just a lot of negative choices that were made that could have been done better. So now we get into the last 30 years where there is no Soviet Union. For a couple years, the United States is not really challenged. They are the global power. There is really no one to rival them until we see the emergence of China in the early 21st century as a major rival to the United States. All right, that's the end of the Cold War.